The Yakuza series is a lot of things. Yakuza is a brawler. Yakuza is a crime drama. Yakuza is a Japanese tourism simulator. Yakuza is absolute absurdity. But above all else, Yakuza is about kindness. It's about the things that good people do despite the most trying and devastating of circumstances and obstacles. Yakuza is about empathy. We'll be talking predominantly about Yakuza 0 today, but rest assured this will be a recurring theme as we eventually cover every game in the series in the future in numerical order. Yakuza 0 may itself seem like an odd place to start, seeing as it is in fact the sixth mainline entry in the Yakuza series, releasing between Yakuza 5 and Yakuza 6, The Song of Life. However, not only is Yakuza 0 a particularly lofty pinnacle in a series which itself represents some of the highest highs in the mountain range of video games, but it's also the perfect prequel and by far the best place to start for any newcomers to the series. Taking place a full 17 years before the bulk of the first game, Yakuza 0 takes us back to the Japan of 1988, a country figuratively on top of the world. Following the parallel storylines of a particularly young and inexperienced Kazuma Kiryu, as well as a fresh-faced but already jaded Majima Goro, Yakuza 0 is a crime drama that sets the bar amongst its medium. It was a game that blew me away the first time I played it in 2019, and based on the explosion of popularity that the series has enjoyed in the West ever since, I'm clearly not alone in my experience. Now, I love Yakuza 0, and I hope that if not already, you will by the end of this review too. In fact, I have been dying to talk about this series since the literal inception of this channel, and returning viewers will certainly be no strangers to the Yakuza flavoured Easter eggs previously and lovingly sprinkled throughout my prior works. I was simply waiting to become somewhat experienced at this whole video game reviewing thingy enough to have a proper go at doing this series justice. When you take on the responsibility of reviewing a series as brilliant and as gargantuan as Yakuza, you've gotta go balls out. With all that said, let's get started. Releasing in Japan on the 12th of March 2015 and worldwide almost 2 years later on the 24th of January 2017, Yakuza 0 represented a watershed moment in the West for Ryuga Gotoku's incredible, previously criminally underrated series. Yakuza 0 functions not only as an extension of the main story, providing some much needed context to a whole host of main and secondary characters within the series, but also presents itself as the optimal place to start. After the mildest of Googling, you'll note that the overwhelming response to the question as to where you'd want to begin your Yakuza series journey is nearly always with 0, and I agree. However, the best time to play Yakuza 0 is not only when you're first starting the series. The best time to play Yakuza 0, in my opinion, is after you've played Yakuza 0. Ideally a good few years and subsequent life events later. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? All I'll say for now is, flick your eyeballs down towards the length of this video, Kyodai. The answer is probably in there somewhere. I'll never tell. Regardless, Yakuza 0 introduces us to perhaps the blankest cleanest slate. This is a very young Kazuma Kiryu, relatively free of baggage, and a young Majima Goro, already accompanied with enough baggage to constipate a small airport. Yakuza 0 shows us a Tojo clan at the top of its game, quite unlike literally every other game in the series, and a Japan living life in the fast lane. Yakuza as a series is incredibly difficult to neatly put into some kind of box, besides the ever usefully ambiguous action-adventure label, because the Yakuza series is basically a genre unto itself. Mixing freely between RPG, brawling and open world elements with a cheeky dash of life simulation underpinning the whole thing, Yakuza 0 is perhaps the pinnacle of Ryuga Gotoku's formula, presenting an experience that is not only a triumph in crime fiction, but also something that is unashamedly a video game. Over the course of this review, I'll be examining just what makes Yakuza 0 so special, from the snapshot in time that it represents, to the successes of its storytelling, to the pure joy of its multiple different aspects of gameplay. With all that said, let's kick things off with a history lesson.
いらっしゃいませ。お客様。
いらっしゃいませ。
Have you ever wondered why popular examples of the cyberpunk genre always seem to feature such prominent East Asian iconography? Well, don't worry, I'll tell you for why. During the 1980s, Japan appeared to be on the fast track to becoming the next big economic superpower. By the end of the decade in 1989, 13 of the top 20 companies in the world were Japanese, covering a wide variety of different industries. Exports were booming, with vehicles being a particularly notable example.
No wonder this circuit failed. It says made in Japan.
What do you mean, Doc? All the best stuff is made in Japan.
Unbelievable.
Of course, it wasn't just Japanese technology that was rapidly making its way overseas, but its culture too. The 1980s was when Japanese animation and video games truly came into their own. Between Nintendo's recent pivot from Hanafuda playing cards to the interactive medium, the birth of a little-known animation company called Studio Ghibli, and the meteoric rise of shows like Fist of the North Star, Mobile Suit Gundam, and, of course, Dragon Ball, more and more people started looking eastwards. In the 1980s, Japan was a phenomenon. Heck, it's only really enjoying a well-deserved renaissance in the West right now, but the 1980s also happened to be when the terminally upbeat Japanese musical movement of city pop was in full swing. Let me tell you, there's no better way to start your day than dancing your way through the kitchen, making breakfast to the dulcet tones of city pop. Meanwhile, during this decade and on the other side of the planet, a novel by a well-known American author was adapted to the silver screen, forever solidifying the cyberpunk genre into the mainstream media. I'm of course talking about Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, better known by its adapted title, Blade Runner. When it comes to science fiction, creatives are naturally influenced by the world around them, using that to extrapolate their potential vision of the future. There's a reason why every Starfleet-serving woman in the 1960s Star Trek serials is wearing a miniskirt, why numerous movies focus on a post-apocalyptic society as the Cold War ran on, such as Mad Max and Planet of the Apes, and why Blade Runner introduced the concept of a cyberpunk society to the big screen, whilst interlacing it with a generous helping of East Asian influences. The point is that during the 1980s, the future looked distinctly Japanese. To be a Japanese citizen of this time, to live at the eye of the storm, was to supposedly live in the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Between 1986 and 1991, its economy enjoyed rapid acceleration as real estate and stock market prices ballooned upwards, taking everything else with it. The costs of land in Japan during this period, particularly in the 6 major cities of Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kyoto, Osaka, and Kobe, absolutely exploded. To own land in these areas was to turn yourself into a multimillionaire overnight. Naturally, this became an era of hollow pursuits, to flaunt your wealth anywhere and any way that you could. It was an age of flamboyance, of superficiality, of infinite wealth. Of course, this rapid inflation and era of prosperity couldn't last forever, and by 1991, the bubble burst, leading to a significantly lower key 1990s for Japan, known as the Lost Decade. Yakuza 0 is set during the winter of 1988, the almost exact halfway point of this bubble period. The bubble period, its upsides and downsides, are integral to the plot and world of Yakuza 0. In fact, the Western adaptation of Yakuza 0's title undersells it to a degree, presumably to appeal to an audience with less knowledge or experience of Japan's bubble. In Japan, Yakuza 0 is called Ryoga Gotoku 0, Shikai no Basho, or Like a Dragon 0, the Place of Oath, or perhaps more literally, Like a Dragon 0, the Promised Land. Now, I won't lie to you, Yakuza 0's English introductory music absolutely slaps, but the original Japanese version does a much better job of establishing the era in which Yakuza 0 takes place. I'll provide a link in the video description to go check out the good work of YouTube user Hizanas, who very kindly uploaded a version of the song with translated lyrics onto the platform. Yakuza 0 is unique in being the first mainline game in the series which isn't set at approximately the same time as it was released. As such, Yakuza 0, whilst bathed in nostalgia, still offers a unique perspective on a unique time, with its 27-year benefit of hindsight. As we'll be discussing throughout this review, Yakuza 0 successfully portrays the bubble period in all its glory. However, wherever there's light, there's shadow, and Yakuza 0 is not afraid to call out the rather numerous and large downsides this era invited, during an age of capitalism and opportunism run amok. Perhaps rather unsurprisingly, considering what we know of the bubble, Yakuza 0's plot is fundamentally about real estate, or more specifically, one tiny plot of land in particular, the empty lot. If you happen to experience the series in the same order I did, beginning with Yakuza 0, you may not have fully understood the importance of the empty lot's location. The empty lot is the final piece of land needed to begin a major development in the area. This project will end up being an absolute staple of the Yakuza series, the Millennium Tower. In the owner's absence, the price of this empty lot has skyrocketed up to billions of yen. Whoever can get their hands on it stands to make a killing. The game opens with our hero, a babyface Kazuma Kiryu, rearranging someone's face in this little plot of land, undertaking what's supposed to be a rather standard Yakuza debt collection. This Kiryu is far younger and less experienced than the absolute paragon of virtue we'll get used to in later games, being barely anything more here than your standard 2-bit street thug. Indeed, the name Yakuza 0 can be inferred to have two meanings. Not only is it the game that precedes Yakuza 1 chronologically, but it is a game in which its lead characters are effectively nobodies. Or, well, zeros, if you will. Anyway, after retrieving the man's wallet, leaving him feeling rather sorry for himself, Kiryu vacates the scene, stepping over Chekhov's newspaper along the way. What follows is the polar opposite of the previous sequence. Whilst Kiryu's crime is committed in shadow, we're suddenly thrust into the bright, warm orange glow of 1980s Tokyo. Drunken revelers parade the streets and clubs, partying the night away, whilst others flash their cash desperately at the fleet of taxis driving past the main street. Kiryu even has a brief run-in with some local goons trying it on with some girls who just want to get home. After getting one good look at him, they think better of it and let him go. This is like literally the only time in the game this happens, by the way. Tokyo goons aren't exactly known for choosing their fights wisely. After a brief conversation with the loan shark he'd been collecting for, Kiryu ends up on a night about town with Nishikiyama, his kyodai or sworn brother. This section of the game serves as a convenient excuse to introduce the player to not only Kamurocho itself, but also the kind of game that Yakuza 0 is going to be. Over the course of this brief section, you'll be getting into a couple of fights, visiting a restaurant, and most importantly of course, belting your heart out to karaoke. Unfortunately from here, things go sideways quickly. Whilst indulging in an unsolicited extra large bowl of ramen, Kiryu finds himself at the heart of a major news development. The man he'd shaken down? Found dead, exactly where he'd left him at the empty lot. He's promptly summoned back to his clan headquarters to report to the three major movers and shakers of the Dojima family, the three lieutenants. These three lieutenants are perhaps the most interesting villains that the series has ever seen, as they so fundamentally represent exactly what it is to be Yakuza, ripping off the rose-tinted goggles of the organisation that Kiryu has developed, in spite and because of his adopted father, Kazama Shintaro. You see, there are basically two contrasting schools of thought regarding the Yakuza in Japan. On the one hand, they are seen as the modern equivalent of the samurai, a necessary evil and balance which allows things to keep functioning. After all, some might argue, organised crime is better than the alternative, disorganised crime, lone wolves and the like. The real Yakuza have gone to great lengths to cultivate this image in various ways, such as engaging in charity following natural disasters like the 2011 tsunami or the Kobe earthquake in 1995. To this end, you'll never find a Yakuza referring to themselves as such, instead opting for the term Ninkyo Dantai, or chivalrous organisation. Of course, organised criminals with a good PR team are still, well, criminals. You really don't have to look too far to see some of the more heinous crimes that the Yakuza have been involved in, from drug and human trafficking to murder, extortion, blackmail, you name it, they've done it. The word Yakuza itself refers to a losing hand in the Japanese card game Oicho Kabu, the numbers 8, 9 and 3. As such, the widely used term of Yakuza is basically synonymous with loser, rubbish, or good for nothing. Returning now to the three lieutenants, they all fundamentally represent one aspect of the reality of being a Yakuza. Daisaku Kuze is a thug. He's certainly not afraid to be a little underhanded, but when all is said and done, he'd much rather settle things with his fists. Kiryu and you, the player, will be reminded of this fact again and again and again and again. Kuze definitely subscribes to the theory of being a modern-day samurai, holding himself to a misguided sense of honour. After he's slighted by Kiryu in the early chapters of the game, he attempts time after time to restore that honour by bringing Kiryu down. Hiroki Awano represents another facet of the Yakuza, and perhaps the most relevant kind considering the bubble era. Awano is all about the flashy lifestyle, the expensive pleasures in life, the fast cars, the women, the curry and golf on the weekends. However, his working methods are particularly nefarious, specialising in extortion, intimidation and blackmail. At one point in the story, he shoots an innocent girl dead just to try and rattle Kiryu. Finally, we have Keiji Shibusawa, the textbook definition of a strong silent type, but in the most toxic possible way. Shibusawa is a schemer. He's the type to sit back silently and watch things play out, predicting exactly the best moment to enter the fray. Shibusawa is by far the most ambiguous and ruthless, with no inhibitions about killing whoever he needs to get to the top. Each of these three lieutenants is vying for the coveted captain position within the Dojima family. The previous title holder, Kazuma Shintaro, Kiryu's father figure and effective sponsor, is currently locked up in prison, leaving quite an important vacancy to be filled. With Kiryu's alleged murderous faux pas, they smell blood in the water. An opportunity to boot Kazuma from the family entirely and nab that prestigious captain position for themselves, as well as all the powers, perks and privileges that come with it. So begins their race to acquire the empty lot for themselves, regardless of who gets hurt, killed or thrown aside along the way. Of course, looking up to Kazuma as he does, Kiryu won't stand for this, forcibly ejecting himself from the Dojima family and the Yakuza as a whole, and allying himself with the mysterious real estate mogul Tetsu Tachibana. Kiryu's story to clear both his and Kazuma's name begins. Meanwhile, many miles away in the glitzy nightlife city of Sotenbori, we're introduced to our second protagonist, Majima Goro. Majima enjoys perhaps the coolest introductory sequence of any character in video game history. Majima is introduced as a man who's in absolute control, a calm, cool and collected character, wise beyond his years, in charge of the Grand Cabaret, the premier destination for revelers, carousers and enjoyers of Sotenbori's extensive nightlife. Majima's first appearance comes in the form of dealing with an almost comically problematic customer. Despite his martial capabilities, Majima on shift is sworn to his duty as a good manager, treating his patrons with the respect that they may or may not deserve. To the outside observer, Majima Goro is the lord of the night, a man at the very top of his game. Behind the scenes, however, this veneer fades away rather abruptly. This is a Majima Goro still reeling from the event shown in Yakuza 4, in which a failed raid saw his Kyodai Saejima go to prison, and in which he was forced to endure Yakuza torture for a year. He's a man trapped within his gilded cage, forced to work the Grand to raise enough money to buy himself back into the Tojo clan with a grim, single-minded determination. Naturally, Yakuza are going to Yakuza, and it becomes apparent very early on in Chapter 3 that Majima's lucrative business senses are simply being used and exploited by the Yakuza. The more money he makes, the higher his price of freedom becomes. The situation seems hopeless until Majima's handler Sagawa, a high-ranking member of the Omi Alliance, offers him something of a lifeline. As a quick aside, the Omi Alliance is not related to the Tojo clan, they are in fact two major rival entities. The Omi Alliance being based in Osaka and the Tojo clan being based in Tokyo. To buy his way back into the Tojo clan, the price Majima must pay is to take a life for the first time. A hit has been put out against Makoto Makimura, a citizen of Sotenbori and supposedly a real piece of work. As one of our two protagonists, naturally the idea of murdering someone is distinctly unpalatable to Majima, but he accepts the grim task, convincing himself that this Makoto Makimura character deserves whatever's coming to him. After a brief investigation around Sotenbori, Majima is led to a massage parlour. At first, it's empty. However, he's very quickly interrupted. In comes a woman. Majima very quickly figures out that she's blind. Attempting to make his escape, he's detected and mistaken for a thief. In a desperate attempt to maintain some kind of cover, he claims to be a client and asks for a massage. Sometime later, the alleged Makoto arrives. He looks like he's been around the block a few times and clocks onto Majima immediately. The tension in this scene is quite palpable as the girl is sent out and the two men collide in one of Yakuza 0's most epic introductory fight sequences. They are promptly interrupted by some Yakuza goons, also on Makoto's trail. Turns out the large man wasn't Makoto at all, but the woman Majima had met earlier. Shaken and confused, Majima flees with Makoto through the streets, eventually finding a place of solitude. At this point, he's presented with rather a difficult, ominous choice. Thus begins the dual storyline of Yakuza 0. 2 men, 2 cities, 2 problems. Like a strand of DNA, twisting, turning, running parallel, yet never quite overlapping. In summary, the Tojo clan is full of evil, power-hungry buggers. The Omi alliance will settle for nothing less than the cold-blooded murder of an innocent blind woman. And Kashiwagi is my dad. But where does that leave us now? We'll be circling back to the main story beat of Yakuza 0 in the penultimate section of this video, the spoilery one. But for now, I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about Yakuza 0's storytelling and gameplay in a much more general sense. Speaking of DNA, let's take a deep dive into Yakuza itself. Let's examine just what makes a Yakuza game a Yakuza game. Yakuza 0 is slick, stylish, and skillful in its storytelling, employing several different ways to do so. Much like the other games in its series, Yakuza 0 is quite a cutscene heavy game, particularly in its early hours. These cutscenes come in several different flavours. Firstly, we have the big budget, fully rendered cutscenes, which show off the character models, their expressions, and the world around them in all their glory. These are typically reserved for the most dramatic moments of the story, of which this game has many. Yakuza 0 employs several real-world prolific Japanese actors, and this is where you can enjoy their exquisite performances to their fullest. I mean, look at those paws. Ain't no TikTok filter going on there. Despite being one of the most unashamedly gamiest video games to ever video game, during these cutscenes it's actually quite easy to forget that you're actually playing a video game, as opposed to watching the latest episode of a prestige television drama. Before we start talking about the in-engine cutscenes, there's another kind of storytelling mechanic which Yakuza 0 employs that's, to my recollection, not in any other game in the series. Sometimes, and quite randomly, Yakuza 0 will switch to these not quite still images for dialogue, in which it looks like every character's mouth is glued shut, much to their dismay. I suspect they were going for some kind of neo-noir, Max Payne-esque, graphic novel kind of style here, but honestly it's so bizarre and detached from anything else the game does that I'm not surprised that it wasn't really brought back in any of the other series entries. I feel that these sequences can work, but if they're the only format of storytelling used for a game's cutscenes. Otherwise, they feel just a little bit underbaked. Of course, for the lighter moments in particular, a lot of Yakuza 0's storytelling is delivered in-engine. These use the actual gameplay models, so the quality of the characters on screen varies drastically, basically depending on their narrative importance. Kiryu, Majima, and any real-world actors are naturally still gorgeous, but the same certainly can't be said for any unfortunate NPCs stuck firmly in support role purgatory. Some of them glamoured up enough to pass for PlayStation 4 characters. Some of them look like the PlayStation 3 characters what they truly are, and some of them look like they arrived in Kamurocho after taking the Shinkansen directly from Yokosuka. Ultimately, this is somewhat understandable. Yakuza 0 itself is a mere stone's throw away from being almost a decade old, which is quite depressing actually, considering it was a game released to celebrate the series' 10th anniversary. That's right, Yakuza 0 is now almost as old as John Travolta's very moving performance as Kiryu in Yakuza 1 was when it released. Besides focusing so heavily on the visuals, I'd be totally remiss if I didn't talk about the voice acting. Yakuza 0's is exceptional, available only in Japanese. Takaya Kurada as Kiryu and Hidenari Ugaki as Majima are of course standouts, having voiced these characters since the very beginning. Still, Yakuza 0 is chock full of excellent performances from some very talented voice actors. Kazuhiro Nakaya, the guy who voices Nishiki, is particularly good. They should bring him back. In all seriousness, Yakuza 0 features not only spectacular voice acting, but also amazing voice direction. You don't even need to speak a hint of Japanese to appreciate the raw talent on display here from Yakuza 0's cast, particularly in a handful of its more impactful, emotionally charged sequences.
俺はな、桐生、兄弟として、おめえにそんな死に方させられねえよ。堂島組に的にかけられるってのはそういうことなんだ。桐生、組織に目つけられて逃げ切ることはできねえ。極道には時効もねえ。お前も分かってるはずだ。
For the most part, every major plot development throughout Yakuza 0's story is fully voice acted, and the game benefits immeasurably from it as a direct result. Yakuza 0's slick presentation also extends neatly into the bulk of its gameplay. I'll be going far more in depth regarding each aspect of this in the next 3 sections, from sub-stories to mini-games and finally combat, but for now I'll continue focusing on Yakuza 0 as a whole, in terms of its genre and design philosophy. As I mentioned earlier in this review, putting Yakuza 0 and by extension the whole Like a Dragon series into a neat little box is incredibly difficult because there's barely anything else like it out there right now. Every so often a game will come along, a game that'll stand out so brilliantly and so uniquely that it'll basically create a genre in and of itself, causing many other games like it to follow. As one example, Doom is widely credited with popularizing the first-person shooter genre. In fact, for the first few years post its release during the 1990s, the term FPS didn't exist. Instead, games of its type were simply known as Doom clones. Heck, terms like Souls-like and Roguelike are still tossed around today, to denote games that resemble the works of From Software, or games that like to hammer the nail in your progression and soul whenever you die. Yakuza is very much the Doom of itself, in 2 ways actually. The first way is how we've just discussed. Its uniqueness creates a whole new category of video game, a strange yet delectable concoction of JRPG, brawler and open world. However, also like Doom, Yakuza did not simply spawn in a total vacuum. Instead, it merely defined and cemented a desire path previously taken by Sega a few years before. Much like Doom was actually preceded by Wolfenstein, to truly understand Yakuza's roots, we need to take a quick look at a little series called Shenmue. Releasing for the Sega Dreamcast in the final days of the last millennium on December 29, 1999, Shenmue was revolutionary in several different ways, perhaps most superficially for its excellent graphics for the time. However, Shenmue is also revolutionary for gamifying the mundane, for forcing the player to actually take their time to hang out in the quiet slice of Japan it's carved out for you, to stay a while and smell the flowers. The first time I tried Shenmue, many years after its original release on the high-definition version of the original duology on PlayStation 4, I bounced off, frustrated by its slow nature, assuming I need to simply stand around for ages, literally glaring at my in-game watch, waiting for the plot to turn up. Naturally, I'd missed the point. Shenmue is a masterclass in immersion. Shenmue not only invented the prototype for Yakuza, but came pretty close to perfecting the concept of the cozy game that's so popular right now, without the need for any kind of obligatory farming mechanic, a la Harvest Moon, Story of Seasons, or, of course, Stardew Valley. Shenmue is, obviously, about Hazuki Ryo's quest to uncover the truth behind his father's murder, through any means necessary.
What is it? I'm looking for sailors.
However, It's also about the tight-knit community of Yokosuka, where everybody seems to know each other's names. It's about meeting with and chatting with members of this community, finding clues, catching up, and turning every single child who wants to play down. It's also about adhering to a curfew, about ensuring Ryo is home by a certain time so that his elderly housekeeper won't worry. Shops in certain locations are only accessible during certain parts of the day, and during these periods of unavailability, Ryo can pass the time by training in the park, gaming in the local arcade, or perhaps most famously by driving a forklift. I bet some of that sounded familiar, didn't it? Unsurprisingly, one look at Shenmue's accredited directors will reveal the link, the thread which binds Shenmue and Yakuza together. First up we have Yu Suzuki, otherwise famous for the excellent Outrun series, which returning viewers will know is a particular favourite of mine. Next up we have the rather elusive Keiji Okayasu, who, according to SegaRetro.com, did a lot of behind the scenes work on Shenmue, Virtua Fighter and Sword of Vermilion, amongst other things. And thirdly, the final director to work on Shenmue was none other than Toshihiro Nagoshi. Now, I know what you're all thinking. That's the Super Monkey Ball guy, right? And, well, 3 things. First of all, you are correct. Toshihiro Nagoshi did direct many of the Super Monkey Ball games. Secondly, Super Monkey Ball is great. However, thirdly, Toshihiro Nagoshi was also responsible for none other than every single Yakuza game and spin-off right up until and including Lost Judgment in 2021. The things he would have learned from Shenmue, the DNA he would have cloned, is readily apparent right there in the Yakuza series, with Zero being no exception. Shenmue takes place in the small, densely packed town of Yokosuka and its local neighbourhood. Yakuza 0 takes place in Kamurocho and Sotenbori, 2 bustling cities at the very heart of the bubble period. Much like Shenmue, these maps are conventionally tiny for a supposed open-world game, but are absolutely packed with dozens upon dozens of different things to do. Kamurocho in particular is a series staple at this point, practically a character of its own right. What may appear to simply be set dressing in one Yakuza game could be home to a crucial story beat or fun side activity in another. Kamurocho is a city of memories and a city of nostalgia. At this point, I literally know my way around Kamurocho at least as well as I know my way around my home city. Additionally, just like Shenmue filled the player's downtime with fun side activities, Yakuza does this too, though via turning the dial up to 11 or 12 in the process. Yakuza 0 is chocked full of these mini-games, though thankfully you aren't beholden to the passage of an in-game clock in the Yakuza series. You can advance the plot whenever you'd like. As such, you're free to go and discover its many mini-games and side stories at your leisure, not simply doing so to have to fill the time. Of course, Kamurocho and Sotenbori are apparently rather rough, with gangsters, drunks and general ne'er-do-wells wandering around everywhere, ready to jump the player at a moment's notice. These are where your random encounters come in, like any good JRPG, though thankfully you can usually see them coming from miles away. And in the spirit of Yakuza 0's focus on money, you're even given a surefire way to avoid most of these encounters. One kind of encounter that I must highlight, however, featuring only in Yakuza 0, is Mr. Shakedown. Mr. Shakedown is a behemoth. Mr. Shakedown is your nightmare. Mr. Shakedown is your mobile banking service. You first encounter Mr. Shakedown very early on into the adventure, and you'll note right away that he's a big lad, sufficiently bigger than any of the other various goons you've encountered thus far. After a quick introductory fight, Mr. Shakedown will vow to keep attacking Kiryu for cash and prestige. Over the rest of the game, you'll be encountering Mr. Shakedown on totally random occasions around Kamurocho. Majima doesn't escape this either, as it turns out Sotenbori has its own local Mr. Shakedown. There are 4 of these goons in total, and they're all absolute tanks. They're also all in possession of literally millions to billions of yen, and felling Mr. Shakedown will result in Kiryu and Majima lining their pockets with their ill-gotten gains. Of course, should you lose, the opposite becomes true. Thankfully, Mr. Shakedown will simply hold on to your money, and if you're able to beat them up later, you'll earn it all back as well as some on top. This system of special encounters was turned up to 11 in Kiwami 1, and I'm very excited to talk about that when we get there. but by and large, this summarises the nature of Yakuza or Like a Dragon's gameplay. Wandering around your local city, nipping into the local ramen place, following it up by a trip to the arcade before getting into a couple of fights with a local riffraff. Before we move on to the specifics, however, I want to make one more point and highlight one more thing which sets Yakuza apart from its open world peers. From the literal inception of the Yakuza series in the West, it's forever been saddled with a comparison that reeks of nonsense. You've probably heard it before. Yakuza? That's just Japanese Grand Theft Auto. So here's the thing. They both take place in cities with freedom of movement revolving around criminal activities. That's it, that's the link. Gameplay wise, it couldn't be any more different. Grand Theft Auto and games like it basically suffer from a narrative and gameplay disconnect. Open world games tend to offer the player total freedom, perhaps with diminishing returns. The idea of playing a hero or anti-hero is somewhat diminished by the fact that you can go and commit acts of terrorism between each gameplay mission. As much as I adore Sleeping Dogs, a game that I've covered previously, it's also true in that case. It's difficult to buy Wei Shen as an undercover cop when he's gone and turned Hong Kong into a one-man war zone. In Yakuza, this simply doesn't happen. As odd as it sounds, Yakuza is literally a brawler that doesn't condone violence, or senseless violence anyway. Rather famously, in an interview with students at the Otemai University in 2011, Toshihiro Nagoshi admitted that despite appreciating that Grand Theft Auto was well made, he hates what it represents. He went on to say, "I simply can't bring myself to promote the emotion that killing is fun, and committing crimes is fun." You'll note when playing Yakuza 0 that Kiryu and Majima are completely unable to start any fights against any innocent passers-by. You can't hop into a car and run over someone's grandmother. No, almost every fight you get into outside of the main story is because of local thugs starting on you. The only time you're going to initiate a fight yourself is when you're intervening to protect a woman or downed salaryman. For you see, despite being young, impulsive and naive, Kiryu and Majima are still here to help, to lend a kind hand to someone in their time of need. Let's focus on that now. Yakuza 0 has an absolute plethora of side quests, known within the series terminology as sub-stories. By and large, these sub-stories are stumbled upon incidentally, usually tactically placed in strategic locations that the players simply can't avoid whilst going about their other activities. Sub-stories are no stranger to the Yakuza series, but it was around the time of Yakuza 0 that they truly started getting kooky and outlandish. Before we get into the content of them, however, I just want to point something out that sets these side quests apart. It's a little thing, but with a pretty important implication. Oftentimes in video games, when presented with a side quest, the player is offered some kind of incentive for doing so. Go kill these bears for me and I'll give you 20 quid. That sort of thing. The classic carrot on the stick method. The player is assumed to want to gain something from the experience, and therefore the potential reward is dangled enticingly up front. Whilst playing Yakuza 0, I noticed something unusual. Kiryu and Majima undertake a lot of side quests throughout Yakuza 0, and sometimes they most definitely do have to be nagged and persuaded into doing so, particularly for some of the more outlandish requests. However, there's pretty much never any kind of reward offered up front. Kiryu and Majima ultimately choose to help these people because it feels like the right thing to do. Of course, the player will still get some kind of reward, but more as a thank you at the end, as opposed to an incentive at the start. In terms of the moment-to-moment gameplay, nothing really changes, but as an insight into the characters of Kiryu and Majima, it speaks volumes. With that out the way, let's talk about the actual realization of the sub-stories themselves. Scattered generously and organically throughout the cities of Kamurocho and Sotenbori, these sub-stories present Kiryu and Majima a golden opportunity to get to know the locals, the absolute characters that populate these bustling cities. These sub-stories offer a chance for some levity over the course of your average Yakuza experience. You've probably noticed during your own playthroughs or through my brief synopsis of the first 4 chapters of Yakuza 0 that this is not a series to shy away from some particularly heavy, mature themes. Yakuza 0 is a game that deals with, amongst other things, actual human trafficking as one example. Between the doom and gloom, these sub-stories present themselves as delightful whimsy, something ridiculously silly to remind you that you're playing what is ultimately a fun video game, designed by people who clearly had a great time doing so. There are several different ways of discovering sub-stories, and perhaps the wackiest of them are the kind you'll find while simply wandering the city streets. As someone who started his own journey through this series with Yakuza 0, I believe the first sub-story I ever encountered was the Yokomichi Silvers. In my most recent playthrough of Yakuza 0 whilst capturing footage for this review, my first encounter with the sub-story was once again the Yokomichi Silvers, almost strategically placed in a location you have a coin flip chance of encountering at this point in the story. As such, I consider it something of a tutorial for the nature of how sub-stories are supposed to work. In this particular adventure, Kiryu is minding his own business walking down the street when suddenly some punk rushes past him, tripping over in the process. What follows is an utterly bizarre conversation in which this punk seemingly can't decide whether to be thoughtful or uncouth. Lost in this bizarre contradiction, he runs away, leaving behind a thoroughly discombobulated Kiryu. Passing by a large crowd of leather-adorned concert-goers at the theatre square moments later, Kiryu once again runs into this curious character. It quickly becomes apparent that this punk is the frontman of a local band, the Yokomichi Silvers, a popular group that are making waves around the local Yankee scene. However, there's one small snag in the fact that neither Crazy Kyo here, as well as his two bandmates, are even remotely hardcore. As the token hooligan, Kiryu gives these poor fellows some instructions on proper Yankee decorum, through the use of multiple choice questions from which the player must choose. These options are then played out for better or for worse on stage as the Yokomichi Silvers take Kiryu's advice for the show. After a presumed roaring success, the band puts on a great show and sends Kiryu on his way with a reward, a fabulously wild shirt. Many of Yakuza 0's sub-stories are structured this way, amusing little micro-adventures in which Kiryu and Majima find themselves in increasingly bizarre, contrived and unbelievable situations, having to navigate their way out sensibly or simply by giving in to the madness. Majima literally, briefly and hilariously joins a cult at one point, simply to rescue a girl whose mother has begged him for help. This sub-story, amongst others, is somewhat grounded in reality, as Japan appears to have a little bit of a real-life cult problem and has done so for a while. Many of these sub-stories also tie in directly to other gameplay mechanics, one of which is the friendship one. First introduced in Yakuza Ishin, having multiple interactions with certain NPCs, often shopkeepers, allows Kiryu and Majima to build friendships for different rewards. Perhaps the most entertaining example of this mechanic in action is an experience and critical misunderstanding that both Kiryu and Majima go through at the local arcades, which wouldn't have been entirely out of place in an episode of Frasier. Upon repeatedly playing Outrun as Kiryu and Space Harrier as Majima, you'll attract the attention of the arcade attendant, an attractive young woman in both cases. Firstly, you'll simply have to beat a high score they've set, whilst you've been running around doing other things. However, upon setting new high scores again, the girls seem to set the stakes that much higher. Focusing on Kiryu for a moment, Luca promises him something truly special, the ride of his life. If it wasn't abundantly clear, she's talking about Super Hang-On. Beating Luca's high score a second time around unlocks the arcade game Super Hang-On, a wild ride indeed. This exact scenario is then mirrored for Majima, as Kyoko promises him to bring out her fantasy zone, should he beat her high score at Space Harrier a second time. She's talking, of course, about the 1986 hit Sega arcade classic Fantasy Zone. Obviously. Get your head out of the gutter, Majima. But seriously, I must applaud the writing team for pulling the same bait and switch joke and delivering it hilariously twice. Now is as good a time as any to talk about the masterful way that Yakuza 0 uses musical themes and motifs to drive the narrative of its sub-stories. Just with the ones I've spoken about, listen to this. Of course, I'd be totally remiss if I were to mention Yakuza 0's excellent sub-story music and not touch upon this absolute banger. This is the kind of music that the hardest and most profound of life's lessons are learned to. Regardless, returning to the sub-stories as a whole, they also present a very convenient and fun excuse to remind returning players of the Yakuza series that Zero is very much a prequel. These mini quest lines are littered with references to other games in the series, many of which go completely over the heads of any first-time players. Yakuza Zero's main story is a guided roller coaster ride, but these sub-stories allow the player to leave the main thrill ride behind for a moment and explore the rest of the theme park, the lovingly handcrafted slices of Tokyo and Osaka that Ryoga Gotoku Studios has prepared for us. These cities feel lived in, primarily because of just how many wacky characters who live and wild stories that occur amidst the hustle and bustle of these neon streets. Of course, Yakuza Zero's game design is layered in true holistic fashion, everything being connected. Many of these sub-stories are connected to Yakuza Zero's many mini-games and side activities, particularly when combined with the friendship mechanic. We've already touched upon this somewhat with the arcade staff, but the fun certainly doesn't stop there. The Yakuza series is, amongst other things, a showcase for Sega's excellent efforts in micro-video game design. Each entry, from Yakuza 1 through to Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, is littered with dozens upon dozens of different thematically appropriate mini-games, the gameplay of most going above and beyond what you'd expect from a simple side activity. Yakuza 0 is no exception to this rule. Upon starting the game and undertaking that first night out with Nishiki, you'll promptly come across the karaoke bar. Karaoke is still somewhat of a foreign concept in video games. The only other example I can think of its inclusion off the top of my head is of course the excellent Sleeping Dogs. This was my first real, well, that's rad moment in the series, as I was promptly blown away by Kiryu and Nishiki's absolutely smashing rendition of Judgment. I still catch myself singing it today. Of course, a few years back, Yakuza enjoyed a bit of a spike in success in the West over the whole Dame Dane guy meme, and Bakamitai is a certified banger, but to choose it over Judgment in this introductory segment is to miss the point of a lad's night out entirely. Following this all too brief tease of Yakuza's wonderful side content, it'll take the player a little while before they unlock the freedom to rediscover just how many things there are to see and do within its world. This is okay, there's lots of gripping plot to get through. Once you have reached this point, however, the entire dynamic of the game changes. Returning once more to examine the map of Kamurocho, you note just how busy it is. Focusing on the purple areas for the time being, each of these coloured squares represents a location within Kamurocho in which you can take part in some kind of mini-game or side activity, sometimes with more than one option available. The arcades are perhaps the most logical place to start, especially considering the Shenmue connection. Featuring in pretty much every single Yakuza game, they serve almost as a museum or a history lesson for some of Sega's prior classics. The selection in Zero is sufficiently lower tech, being a game set in 1988, but you're still able to play right through some fantastic retro games like Outrun, Space Harrier, and Super Hang-On. Of course, you'll also note the presence of the UFO catchers or crane games, which are thankfully just biased enough towards the player that it's never too frustrating when trying to retrieve certain items for sub-stories or collection bonuses. Moving on, Kamurocho also finds itself home to many other staples of a classic day out, such as bowling, pool, and darts. The design of the bowling and pool minigames in particular are standouts for me, functioning at least as well as many full dedicated video games to pool and bowling. The darts I definitely struggle with, though I'm not sure if that's more of a game design issue or a skill issue. Personally, I prefer the Dragon Engine version of darts. Yakuza 0 also features a batting centre. I must confess that I almost completely avoided it in my playthrough. Baseball is a much bigger deal in places like Japan and South Korea than it is in the UK. But what I will say is that I'll definitely be delving into the batting mechanics a lot more in future videos, particularly for Yakuza's 5 and 6. Next up, we have the rhythm-based minigames of Yakuza 0, Karaoke and Disco. I've already talked about Karaoke a little, but I'll expand further upon it here. Karaoke is about pressing the correct button prompts in time in order for Kiryu or Majima to properly carry their tune. Should you do a particularly good job, you'll unlock a special video to enjoy for the latter sections of the song. Kiryu can choose between Judgment and Bakamitai, whilst Majima can only select 24-hour Cinderella. However, you'll notice the presence of 3 other songs that they both share, entitled Shine, Heartbreak Mermaid, and Rouge of Love. These are typically songs better suited towards women by Yakuza's logic, and can therefore only be experienced properly if Kiryu brings along a date, or if Majima brings along one of the girls from his club. More on that later. I'll interject here just to point out how much these minigames say about both the characters of Kiryu and Majima. Yes, they're both very gritty people, they've been through the ringer and back, and have both led incredibly hard lives. But man, if they don't give it their all at these various low-stakes experiences. Don't believe me? That's cool, but check out these moves. Disco is wonderful, a proper snapshot of the clubbing culture at the time, with a challenging minigame that's an assault on the senses. Navigating your cute little avatar with the appropriately matching frowny face or eye patch to the correct square in time, whilst also making as many steps as possible on the grid, whilst also ensuring that you hit the correct button at the correct moment, is incredibly satisfying when pulled off correctly, and devastating when not. The dancing minigame is also particularly noteworthy in Kiryu's case, being one of the handful of minigames which also features a full-on sub-story chain, in which Kiryu asserts himself as Kamurocho's top dancer, beating out a future familiar face along the way. Next up, and in what can only be described as the fan service trilogy, we have The Telephone Club, Catfighting Arena, and Gandhara Video. Yeah, this is the point in the review where I wonder if Yakuza's game designers needed to step away from their computers a bit, namely for a cold shower and a lie down. First up, we have The Telephone Club. Besides not being a minigame that you'd want to play in public, it's basically about finding a date for Kiryu. This is done by selecting the right words and phrases to impress the girl enough to want to hang out with you. First up though, you'll need to pick up the phone in the correct manner. Here's how it's done. Kiryu is a massive dork, and I love him. There are 3 stages to this minigame, in which you find out about the girl's body type, what she looks like, and whether you can score that date. The right answer is usually blindingly obvious, but the challenge comes in how hard it is to actually select the silly thing. Yakuza 0 ingeniously gamifies the initial difficulty one might find of overcoming their nerves and talking to a new acquaintance of the opposite sex by making the minigame mechanics comically fiddly. Once you've successfully managed to navigate the trials of telephone dating, you'll unlock one of several different sub-stories revolving around your date. If you're lucky, you'll find one of the 3 girls Kiryu can subsequently invite to various activities around the city, else you run the risk of being stood up or finding someone that Kiryu doesn't particularly care for. Next up, we have the Catfighting Club. Look at it. I honestly don't think I need to explain what's going on here to you, it's pretty on the nose. What I will say though is that it's what you get if you take rock paper scissors, added button mashing, and then stuck it in a thong. Apparently it's a great way to make money within the game, but I only ever found myself going here when it's first introduced in the story, and later as part of a certain NPC's challenge. Lastly, we have the Gandhara. This is barely even a minigame, it's literally just softcore porn of contemporary Japanese actresses. It's got a good punchline though. These videos are unlocked by finding these girls in certain sub-stories or activities and aided by Mr. Libido. Oh yeah, there was no way I was going to review Yakuza 0 and not talk about Mr. Libido. You'll find this absolute legend very early on in the game, in Majima's first chapter, just doing his thing at one of the local nightclubs. Shortly thereafter, you'll run into him again for a proper introduction, after which he'll appear at various spots around Sotenbori to lead Majima in the right direction to meet more girls. Kamurocho also has its own Mr. Libido, but with a real we have one at home energy. Moving on, Yakuza 0 is also home to a lot of minigames that are particularly foreign to any Western players. There's a lot of Asian gambling games, as well as more Western gambling games, but there's 2 minigames in particular that simply scare me. I'm talking about Mahjong and Shogi. I certainly don't dislike either mahjong or shogi. I wouldn't mistake my ignorance for genuine criticism, but I often find myself completely ignoring these in every Yakuza game, due to their particularly high barrier for entry. I'll applaud their interfaces though. Playing shogi reminds me of booting up an old Windows 98 game like chess or solitaire for those dark days when you couldn't use the internet because your mum was on the phone. At last, we come to the meat and potatoes, the defining side activities that make Yakuza 0, Yakuza 0. Kiryu has 2, Majima has 1 and a bit, sort of. To get that weird one out of the way, I'm talking about the weapon manufacturing system that Majima can do via the Dragon and Tiger Chinese restaurant. It's basically an idle game in which you send various agents off to find weapons and components for you before checking back in later for the rewards. I'll be honest, I'd find this a lot more useful if Majima didn't already come equipped with an indestructible bat. Speaking of components, we can instead focus on the far more enjoyable, engaging and fleshed out minigame of Pocket Circuit Racing. Returning viewers of this channel may recall that I've brought this up before in my Gotoku HG1 aka Penny Racers review, referencing that game's similarity in having to build up a vehicle using the correct parts to triumph in each race. It's an experimental process of trial and error that I actually really enjoyed. I found shopping around for and selecting the correct parts very rewarding, and reminiscent of the Pocket Circuit Racing minigame in Yakuza 0. But more on Pocket Circuit Racing and Yakuza 0 in general in the Having a Mosey Season 2 finale. Coming soon, Pocket Circuit Racing is not only a full-on video game, but comes packaged with not one, but 2 associated sub-story chains, coming together in the end for a grand finale. Pocket Circuit Racing is ultimately about building up little toy cars using the appropriate components and putting them to the test in a series of increasingly convoluted courses against 3 other competitors with the occasional head-to-head. These components are primarily bought from the on-site shop, but there are a few other shops around Kamurocho that stock them. The acquisition of some parts is unfortunately tied to RNG, but fortunately, as demonstrated in Sirix's masterful game FAQs guides, you can beat the entire thing using only purchasable parts. Once you've assembled and customized your little car, the racing can begin. For better or worse, you don't really get to control your Pocket Circuit Racer, being limited only to using 1 or 2 boosts and the occasional button mash to prevent your car from flying off the track. However, finding the correct combination of parts and watching your vehicle dominate the competition is tremendously rewarding, and a satisfying payoff from all the trial and error that goes into preparing your car for each race. Once you've beaten the thing, you can even go ahead and create your own courses. RGG Studios honestly went way harder than they needed to with this silly little minigame, and this generosity in their design philosophy makes Yakuza 0 a much better game for it. Of course, I do love Pocket Circuit Racing, but not quite as much as Kiryu loves Pocket Circuit Racing. I mean, seriously, have you seen the cost of some of these late game parts? Kiryu is like the only adult in the room. How are a bunch of children supposed to pay for all this? What kind of grown man would spend an exorbitant amount of money on toy cars that are made for children? You get the point. Kiryu's other major side activity, and really the main source of your income over the bulk of the game, is through something called the Real Estate Royale. As we've previously discussed much earlier in this review, the bubble period was all about boundless wealth through properties, and Yakuza 0 presents an opportunity for Kiryu and the player to get their piece of the action. During the events of Chapter 5, as a full-fledged employee of Tachibana Real Estate, Kiryu and Oda here meet up with a client, Yamanoi-san. This presents us with not only a handy tutorial in the art of Japanese business etiquette, but also establishes an important connection for Kiryu, resulting in his acquisition of Yamanoi's business. In short, Real Estate Royale is about buying out as many properties as you can in Kamurocho, separated into 5 distinct areas, and making literal squillions of yen in the process. Of course, in the cutthroat world of business, it really isn't as simple as all that. Enter the 5 billionaires. Each billionaire is a ruthless business person in their own right, driving people out of their homes, pricing out small businesses, pimping out vulnerable women, you name it. Each of these billionaires controls one of the 5 major slices in Kamurocho, and Kiryu will be taking them on one at a time. Regarding the actual gameplay of Real Estate Royale, it's largely pretty passive, with a lot of your time simply spent waiting for your rent collections to come in so you can use it to buy additional properties, as well as investing in and upgrading your current ones. New properties properties are acquired by scouting them out and about in Kamurocho. The game does provide a list of each property, but doesn't specifically tell you where they are within each location, resulting in quite a lot of smushing Kiryu's face into various buildings around the city until you find the prompt to buy them. Once you've bought a new property, you share in that whilst area increases. When it comes to investing and upgrading, thankfully there's a little bit more to it. Most buildings you acquire will start at a low rank, C or D, and you'll need to spend quite a lot of money investing in these businesses to increase their rank. Once they go up a level, your share in the area will increase again and their payouts will increase. You invest in these properties by assigning different members of staff, such as managers and security, as well as lots of different advisors with different specialties. How do you go about acquiring new staff? This, in my opinion, is where Yakuza 0 delivers a real masterstroke. The vast majority of your staff comes from people you've aided throughout the various sub-stories that you completed around Kamurocho. Once you've aided someone around the city and you've begun Real Estate Royale, you'll find them hanging around outside the building. One quick conversation later and they've signed up to your cause. I used the word holistic earlier, not only because it's a particularly good word if you ask me, but because it truly is the case with Yakuza's game design. Pretty much every system is inextricably linked to another, presented in an organic fashion that once again makes Kamurocho seem alive. On the same topic, talking about the friendship mechanics earlier, these can also pay off in similar fashion too. Upon maxing out Pocket Circuit Fighter's relationship after completing Pocket Circuit Racing, he'll add the Pocket Circuit Arena to Kiryu's property holdings. Help a bashful, scarred police officer rediscover his cause, he'll sign up as a member of security. Befriend the bowling alley girl and achieve 3 strikes in a row, the bowling alley is yours, as well as a free chicken who will join your staff as a manager. His name is Nugget, and he's awesome. As you progress through each area, buying and upgrading lots of different properties, you'll get taunted and trash talked by the billionaire of each area, until eventually they'll issue you a challenge. These challenges will always involve besting them with some kind of minigame that's available in their area, such as karaoke, outrun or disco. Mercifully, mahjong and shogi are not included, though I'm particularly salty that catfighting is. To win these challenges is to gain an extra 10% share value in these areas, and to lose is to, well, lose 10% shares. Losing isn't a game ender, but it can still set you back considerably. Once you've reached 90%, they'll issue a second challenge. This time it's just a fight, no bells or whistles. Upon besting each billionaire, Kiryu secures their areas, they have a change of heart, and join your cause, no matter how evil they may have been before. Before I talk about the final stages of the Real Estate Royale, we're going to switch over to Majima once more. It's time to talk about the best minigame in Yakuza 0 and perhaps in the whole series. Oh yeah, it's the Cabaret Club. Where do I even start with the Cabaret Club? Okay, here's what a Cabaret Club is. A cabaret club is a place for, in this case, men to go and essentially pay to hang out platonically with a woman. The whole affair does seem rather classier than it is on the surface. It's transactional, but the only thing being sold is a conversation, and lots of alcohol. So how on earth does this translate into a video game? Excellently, apparently. Throughout the events of Chapter 7, Majima finds himself at a cabaret club, a significantly scaled down version of the Grand Cabaret which he runs himself already. It becomes apparent very quickly that this place, Club Sunshine, is struggling. It only has 3 girls on staff, and Majima appears to be the only customer. Club Sunshine is in such dire straits because of a cabal of several much bigger clubs, known as the 5 Stars, who've muscled into the Sotenbori area and all but monopolised the nightlife scene. If they aren't stopped soon, they may even close the Grand. You may notice a couple of parallels between Majima and Kiryu's side activities here, and congratulations on your pattern recognition. Not to brag or anything, but I can count to 5. Indeed, once more, the crux of the Cabaret Club Czar involves taking on each of these rival clubs one at a time, earning more fans, and hiring and training up more girls, to beat them all one-on-one in a Cabaret Club battle. You can still go wandering around Sotenbori to find local businesses to partner with to acquire these super important fans, but Cabaret Club Czar is a lot more involved than Real Estate Royale is. Firstly, in a similar fashion to Kiryu, many of the girls you hire are done so from the various sub-stories you've helped them out in. Of particular note is Etsuko, otherwise known as the Obitarian, or Scary Grandmother for all intents and purposes. Despite your typical cabaret club worker being a young woman, the Obitarian here is literally and hilariously one of your most skilled and capable members of staff. Regardless, it is the case that whilst every girl you hire can be leveled up and improved, Some of them stand head and shoulders above the rest and are referred to as your platinum hostesses. This is where the fun stuff comes in. Did you know that Yakuza 0 is secretly a dress-up game that would put most Barbie video games to shame? I mean, I literally take far more care in dressing these girls up properly, applying half-decent makeup and maxing out their stats than I do when creating my character in any other role-playing games. You're also able to level these platinum hostesses up in between openings through customer service training. This offers Majima a chance to get to know these women properly, and they all also have a built-in sub-story to round out their training and character arc. My favourite is still Yuki, she's hilarious.
そうですね。寒いですね。
Getting to the core gameplay, this is where Cabaret Club Czar shines. I genuinely think it could stand on its own as a dedicated mobile game for sure. In short, Club Sunshine has 6 booths. Over the 3 minutes of each session, several blokes will come in, and it is Majima's job to assign the best girl to each customer's requirements. There are several different attributes, from the superficial, beauty, cute, etc. to their personalities, whether they like to party, have a chat, crack jokes, etc. Typically, the wealthier the customers are, the more obnoxiously picky they are. You have several options on how to deal with these people, but in my club they're always shown the door, thank you very much. Finally, besides assigning the correct girls to the correct customers, you'll also have to act the part of a doting waiter on certain occasions. The girls will occasionally request your help, be it for a gentleman's glass, a lady's glass, menu, ashtray, and so on. To keep things moving swiftly, you'll have to read their hand signals to select the correct item. Doing so will increase the customer's mood, boost the girl's health, and increase the amount of money that they spend. I'll be honest, I'd not played through the Cabaret Club Czar for years before replaying it recently for my review, and yet I still remembered what every single hand signal meant. It's just like riding a bike. Much like Kiryu's Real Estate Royale, the Cabaret Club Czar is neatly divided into 5 chapters, courtesy of the 5 rival clubs you'll be taking on. Upon acquiring a certain number of fans in a club's area, you'll have the option to scout the club in question out, usually resulting in some kind of hilarity before the gauntlet is thrown down and the Cabaret Club battle begins. By far and away the most important thing in each Cabaret Club battle is ensuring you have enough fans in your rival club's area. Having skilled girls is one thing, but it's pretty moot if no customers turn up. Pro tip, when you beat a rival, use some of the money you've gained to run around partnering up with every business you can. It'll always give you such a massive head start. The personalities of the 5 stars vary greatly. Some are accommodating when you beat them, some of them want to throw down with you. This guy calls you a loser, even when you win. That's not very nice. I don't play video games to be called a loser. If I wanted to be called a loser, I would literally just leave my house. Regardless, once you've bested the final club, Club Moon, as Majima, and beaten down the Media King as Kiryu, the final part of each business is unlocked. There are going to be some minor spoilers here, so feel free to skip to the end of the chapter should you wish to avoid these. Both plot lines surrounding Real Estate Royale and Cabaret Club Czar revolve, rather fittingly, around money. They're about how the senseless acquisition of wealth can corrupt, even though you may start out with good intentions. Neither of these plotlines are anything to write home about, but it's refreshing to see storytelling like this in a game set in an era of blind consumerism. Regardless, beating the Real Estate Royale as Kiryu and the Cabaret Club Czar as Majima unlocks their 4th and final combat styles, the Dragon of Dojima and the Mad Dog of Shimano, their legendary abilities you'll become very acquainted with over the rest of the series. By and large, this covers pretty much everything in terms of Yakuza 0's side content. The Cabaret Club Czar rules and was brought back in Kiwami 2 for good reason. The Real Estate Royale was basically rebuilt and improved in Yakuza Like a Dragon, but it's still enjoyable here as a background activity and will grant you stupid amounts of money throughout the game. Of course, we've talked a lot about money throughout this review, as well as how to make it, but in Yakuza 0, where exactly does it all go? Funny you should ask.
一丁景気のやれや
Yakuza 0's combat is brutal. It's visceral, bloody, impactful, varied, and above all else, delightful. Yakuza's combat engine has gone through several different iterations over the years, basically evolving from the traditional brawlers of old all the way to a robust turn-based system inspired by Dragon Quest and executed like Persona. I've personally always thoroughly enjoyed the more modern Dragon Engine's take on the brawling style of combat, seen in Yakuza 6, Kiwami 2, Gaiden and the Judgment games, but there's still something so tremendously satisfying about the totally arcadey, over-the-top nature of the combat in the engine used in Yakuza 5 through Kiwami, including Zero. It's swift, tangible and responsive. Initially, you'll only have access to one style per character. Kiryu begins with Brawler and Majima with Thug. These styles very much reflect the unrefined nature of each character in their early days, featuring a lot of street moves, wild maneuvers and dirty techniques. However, both protagonists end up learning an additional 2 styles in their introductory chapters, bringing them up to 3 each and then with a total of 6 combat styles. Starting with Kiryu, he begins the game with Brawler. Brawler very much is that unrefined yet powerful street fighting style. It's perhaps the most recognisable of Kiryu's combat styles to series veterans, representing what is almost certainly supposed to be the precursor to his legendary Dragon of Dojima style. Brawler sees Kiryu throw some of his wildest punches, hurling himself at his foes with little regard for defense and his own personal safety. Whilst using Brawler style, Kiryu also has the option to pick up certain things on the street to use as makeshift weaponry. Let me tell you, were Yakuza 0 a game about cycling, Kiryu would be the villain of the story. It's whilst using Brawler that Kiryu encounters a mysterious old foreign man named Bacchus, notable for his legendary cry, "Hey, bye!" Bacchus sees a lot of potential in Kiryu, initially trying to recruit him as a boxer. When this is obviously unsuccessful, he instead settles for being his trainer. Each combat style in the game has an associated trainer, besides the 2 you'll unlock from the side businesses, and these characters will help Kiryu and Majima unlock their true potential, each having 5 special moves per form to teach. Returning to these styles now, after first encountering the 3 Dojima lieutenants, Kiryu learns the rush combat style. Learning these forms is always hilarious, as Kiryu or Majima will basically just stumble upon an altercation, watch one party beat the other senseless in a particularly innovative way, go "that's rad," and suddenly they're channeling it for themselves. Whilst Brawler is an all-rounder form, Rush is about speed and deftness. Rush is about lots and lots of dodging with rapid-fire hits, being quick on your toes to evade any attacks the enemy may return at you. Being able to dodge multiple times in a row is a fantastic way of putting a lot of ground between you and any particularly dangerous enemies. I will say that I personally struggled with Rush in Yakuza 0. I felt like it never quite did enough damage to warrant using. Also, the training you have to undergo new abilities, having to dodge the attacks of random thugs, is a real pain in the neck. Next up we have Beast Style, taught by the absolute debt collecting icon Miss Tatsu. Beast Style is about being an absolute tank and systematically destroying Kamurocho's fledgling Deliveroo industry. Beast attacks are wild and do hit much slower, but with that much more impact. Additionally, Kiryu will automatically pick up anything he can on the street, even heavier things like motorbikes and billboards, to have a significantly harsher word with his foes. Switching to Majima now, he begins the game with Thug, very much another take on the crude street fighting theme. Thug is about fighting dirty. One of the first moves you'll learn is an eye gouge, and you'll be using this very much as Majima's most technical style, seeing as his other fighting styles are all hilariously ridiculous. Majima's trainer is a curious old man called Komaki. He'll become important later. Next up, Majima learns the form Slugger. Now, Yakuza 0 has the option to use weaponry, but honestly you'll be pretty hard pressed to find too many situations that can't simply be solved with your fists. I find myself particularly put off with Yakuza's weapons also because it has a durability system that would make Breath of the Wild blush. However, with Slugger, Majima gets an indestructible baseball bat. Oh, did I say baseball bat? I meant nunchucks. Seriously, nunchucks, look at them go. This may honestly be the best move in the whole game. It's super easy to pull off and nothing can touch you. I'm told there's more to this form, but I've been hard pressed to find it. Finally, the flashiest style in the game by far is Breaker. Upon encountering a dance-off on Uraowl Bridge, inspiration strikes and Majima designs an entire martial art around breakdancing. Breaker is a particularly fantastic form when it comes to clearing up groups of thugs, perhaps not doing the most amount of damage ever, but hitting multiple targets simultaneously. As you can imagine, the folks Majima encounters on the bridge become his dancing instructors. Of course, Yakuza 0 is not just a simple button masher with no flair whatsoever. Should you watch any video or compilation of its combat, you'll notice some particularly flashy and devastating techniques. These are called heat moves, and really call into question the notion that allegedly Kiryu doesn't kill. Upon scoring enough hits upon your enemies and or successfully taunting them when they're down, Kiryu and Majima build up something called heat, represented by the 3 bars below their health on the top left corner of the screen. The fuller their heat is, the more powerful moves they can pull off. Heat moves are very situational, and there are dozens upon dozens of these nasty surprises to find. Some can only be pulled off when you're getting about to being knocked down, whilst others require certain weapons to be equipped or positions relative to walls to be taken. Pulling off a heat move is very satisfying and can often turn the tide of battle against certain bosses, and Yakuza 0 does an amazing job of conveying the impact of each strike. Fists are highlighted, the sound effects are efficacious, and your targets will fly. Yakuza 0 is not as gory as something like Mortal Kombat, but the injuries are still palpable as blood flies from your foes. In the context of Yakuza 0's bubble economy, enemies will also explode piñata-like with cash every time you land a particularly hard attack. Of course, I'd be amiss in talking about Yakuza 0's combat without talking about its tremendously unique leveling system. Prior and subsequent Yakuza games for the most part behave as you'd expect them to, much like most other kinds of RPG. The more fights you get into, the more experience you gain, the more levels you increase, taking your stats with them. However, much within Yakuza 0's theme of being constantly flushed with cash, leveling operates very differently here. Instead of automatically gaining skills and stat boosts, you must instead engage with a system entitled investing in yourself. Basically, pretty much any and all money you gain knocking around Japan, be it through the real estate, cabaret club, or looted from goons, will be spent buying these various upgrades for your characters. Quite how this works physically is beyond me, and even Kiryu seems to have no idea. However, in the spirit of Todd Howard himself, it just works. Most of these upgrades are ludicrously expensive too, meaning that you'll always have a use for any money you make. Early on, you'll note that a lot of the more expensive abilities are inaccessible, only unlockable by progressing through Kiryu's Real Estate Royale or Majima's Cabaret Club Czar, giving you yet another reason to pursue these side hustles. Seeing as the legendary forms of Dragon of Dojima and the Mad Dog of Shimano are largely secret bonuses, the only upgrades you can get here are stat boosts for all forms. You can't really develop them any further from when you unlock them. As much as I do love Yakuza 0's combat system, I have but 2 minor nitpicks. Firstly, building up the heat you need can take a little while, but man, it drains incredibly quickly. Taking hits will kill your heat a little, but so will not being able to land an attack on any particularly well-defended enemy. As such, sometimes the flow of battle can drag as momentum is lost. Additionally, switching between the forms is always a very slow, deliberate action. You can't work a switch into any combos or anything. Time does slow down a little, and you can even do some damage with Slugger, but this is definitely improved upon in Yakuza Kiwami. Ultimately, Yakuza 0's combat feels like a natural evolution of Sega's old-school brawlers and translates well into the 3D engine. Should you want to give yourself even more of a challenge, there's also a Coliseum to be unlocked where you can truly put yourself to the test. Additionally, upon completing certain chapters, you'll unlock challenges called Climax Battles, which you can attempt from the main menu. These range from fun, to totally unfair, to downright upsetting. Regarding the content of this section, I pretty much spent the bulk of my time writing the rest of this review wondering how to tie it all together. I thought of continuing my beat-for-beat analysis of the story as I had done earlier for the first 4 chapters, interjecting with my own analysis and contexts. However, we'd be here for a very long time, and as you can clearly see, this review has gone on long enough. As such, I'll talk about the remainder of the story in a much more general sense, but with a pretty liberal sprinkling of spoilers. I put a visual spoiler warning at the introduction of this chapter, but if you happen to be podcasting this thing, here's an auditory one. Please feel free to skip to the bottom line if you feel so inclined. Yakuza 0 is a game about sticking to your convictions. It's a game about standing by your principles, regardless of whether the whole world seems to be against you or not. To borrow a particularly cheesy yet somewhat applicable phrase from Doctor Who, demons run when a good man goes to war. Yakuza 0 is a masterclass in storytelling, drip-feeding the player just enough to keep them guessing, allowing them the chance to figure out the big twists, yet still blowing us away in their delivery. Yakuza 0 is one of those games that just keeps outdoing itself. You may think, this game has definitely peaked here, upon experiencing a particularly noteworthy event, just to be enthralled all over again a few chapters later. You may see things coming and adapt to the level of Yakuza storytelling for 4 or 5 major story beats, but then that 6th beat hits. Some notable examples are Majima's introduction in Chapter 3, the heart-rending scene between Kiryu and Nishiki in Chapter 6, and when Makoto and Tachibana are finally reunited tragically in Chapter 14. It's perfectly possible, well in advance, to call that Makoto Makimura is the missing owner of the empty lot, the tiny little plot of land that's the cause of so much heartache and violence. Yet these revelations are still delivered excellently, and by the time you've reached that point in the game, the plot reaches one explosive crescendo after another. The Yakuza series can occasionally jump the shark a little bit, one notable example in Kiwami 2 immediately springs to mind, yet for the most part, Yakuza 0 remains grounded and tells a very human story of connection, suffering and devotion to your morals. I opened this review with what I think is a particularly powerful quote from French journalist, author and philosopher Albert Camus for this very reason. In the darkest of winter, the hardest of times is when we're presented with opportunities to embrace our inner strength, or summer. The sun will always shine again. Kiryu is naturally a much younger, inexperienced man here, far removed from the stoic, wise father figure we'll see in later games, but still his flames of righteousness flicker silently behind his eyes. He's willing to do anything to clear his name, not for his own gain, but to protect his father figure Kazuma Shintaro. To this end, he puts himself through the ringer, at war with the Dojima family and a wanted man for a large portion of his story. Despite his initial attempts at cutting off those around him to protect them, he eventually realises he's far better off with help, as verbally emphasised by Tachibana during a scene in one of the later chapters. Oh yeah, we're talking the power of friendship. Yakuza 0 is very much a bit of a boys' club, yet the upside of focusing so intently on its male cast members is that it does a fantastic job of demonstrating positive masculinity. The Kiryu of 1988 still has a lot of growing up to do, but already he's presented as a man who'll protect and respect the innocent, stand firm to his ideals, or even show copious amounts of emotion when in some particularly harrowing situations. Or fun ones. I know Kiryu's constant frowny face is a bit of a meme, but that really is only half the story. He's not quite the human golden retriever that Ichiban is, but between them they both represent different flavours of what it means to be a good man. Put it this way, Kiryu is the kind of character that Ryoga Gotoku Studios won't allow to guest star in the Tekken series because there's absolutely no way he'd ever consider hitting a woman in any context, even outside of series canon. However, he will guest star in Super Monkey Ball Banana Mania as a chibi version of himself, chugging energy drinks at every conceivable opportunity. What a guy! Majima is a bit more of an interesting study, seeing as he undergoes a pretty wild transformation that we'll be addressing in later episodes, but for the most part he shares these qualities with Kiryu too, in Yakuza 0 at least anyway. Majima's story is much more of an ill-fated romance, falling for the girl he was supposed to kill, harbouring her from every Yakuza in Sotenbori before eventually giving her up to guarantee that she'll have a much more normal, happy life. Majima certainly does suffer for a moment of weakness as he gives in to cynicism, a moment exploited by Dave Kiwami and his boys here, but thankfully he promptly bounces back. Along the way, he encounters some truly weird characters, namely Nishitani, who proves to be a particularly acute influence on Majima's character arc going forward. Despite what I said about Yakuza 0 being a bit of a boys' club, I do have to shout out Makimura Makoto as a particular highlight as characters go. This poor woman has an awful time. Initially the child of a Japanese-Chinese post-war relationship, the people of China are very suspicious of her family. Her brother, Tachibana, moves to Japan to run away, and a few years later she and her mother follow. Her mother dies, and she's sold into a sex trafficking ring by none other than Oda, who'd later become her brother's right-hand man. Her experiences are so harrowing that she's inflicted with trauma-induced blindness before being rescued by Lee, a former Chinese gangster now turned masseuse, who becomes her father figure. Of course, her rotten luck continues as she winds up being the owner of this empty lot, a ridiculously valuable property that every Yakuza from Kanto to Kansai and back has their eye on. Despite spending most of the story blind, dodging assassination attempts after kidnapping after further trauma, Makoto never gives in. In a world of pretty much literal superhuman gangsters, it is the wounded, traumatized blind girl who faces them head on and says, "No, that's enough." As a Final Fantasy IX fan, I find elements of Princess Garnet here, the girl who'd face her greatest threats regardless of the consequences. It is somewhat of a shame that this attempt at revenge is ill-advised and easily thwarted, serving mainly to unlock Majima's true nature, the Mad Dog. But in my opinion, she's still a badass and my hero. Yakuza 0 ends very much like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, in that it doesn't. For a while. And a bit longer. In both cases, I have no complaints, as Yakuza 0 leaves absolutely no stone unturned. The final sequences of Yakuza 0 are truly epic. Despite never meeting, Kiryu and Majima effectively pull off a beautiful two-pronged attack against the Dojima family, crippling them for the foreseeable future. Majima conducts a one-man raid on Dojima headquarters, defeating Awano as well as Dojima's Scooby-Doo villain of a bodyguard, putting the fear of the Mad Dog to the top man himself. Meanwhile, Kiryu, after beating up Kuze one more time for good luck, rushes to save Makoto once more from Shibusawa, the final Dojima lieutenant who'd really been pulling the strings all along. What ends is an epic battle between these two men, two dragons even, in an ultimate force of will. In a fit of rage, Kiryu almost makes a terrible mistake, but is talked down by Nishiki, a beautifully and tragically poetic moment considering what the future has in store for these sworn Kyodai. Ultimately, Kiryu prevents Kazuma's removal from the Tojo clan and rejoins the now sufficiently humble Dojima family. Majima rejoins the Shimano family, setting himself up to be there for his sworn brother Saijima when he's finally released from prison. You'll note that over the entire course of this story, despite coming incredibly close on numerous occasions, Kiryu and Majima never meet. This was an incredibly bold choice from Gotoku Studios, and honestly I respect the heck out of it. Yakuza 0 provides ample backstory to many of the original game's characters whilst preserving canon to the best of its ability. To have Kiryu and Majima meet would have been nothing more than shameless fan service, convoluting the canon and... oh, alright then.
Yo. Kiryu-chan!
What a way to close out the game. 10 out of 10, 5 stars, no notes. To begin your journey into the Like a Dragon series, be it through Yakuza 0, Judgment, Like a Dragon, or anywhere else, is to embark upon a Japanese odyssey, an epic tale spanning over 30 in-game years, following some of the most interesting and fully fleshed out video game characters to ever grace our TV screens or monitors. Perhaps one of the greatest things about beating Yakuza 0 for the first time is knowing that you've still got a dozen games just like it, mainline or spin-off, still to go. I remember that when I first beat Yakuza 0 all the way back in the before times of 2019, the dust had barely settled on my PlayStation 4 copy of the game before I placed an order for Yakuza Kiwami, the next chronological game in the series. Playing Yakuza 0 again for the purposes of this review in 2024, I found my experience rather enhanced in a way, despite retreading familiar ground. You may recall that at the beginning of this video, I posited that the best time to play Yakuza 0 was not only when you were starting the series, but after you'd played Yakuza 0. Had you not instantly shut the video down after that, in a blind fit of rage at my babbling nonsense, I can now provide some context for you. Amongst everything else we've talked about, Yakuza 0 is a game about remembering. It's a game with nostalgia baked into its DNA. It's the first game in the series to be set long before its release date, celebrating the success of the series over its first 10 years. It's a game set in a time of unprecedented prosperity for Japan. Unlike every other game in the series in which the streets of Kamurocho seem rather lifelike and Spartan, here they are baked in the warm, soft yellow glow of perhaps simpler times for a lot of people now long gone. Nostalgia is a concept that I've returned to again and again on this channel, with the eventual goal of ending up here, a game that is, for all intents and purposes, perhaps the most literal realization of a nostalgia trip that I've ever seen. This is why you should play Yakuza 0, several years and at least one major life-changing event after playing Yakuza 0. What better way to experience a game so intrinsically about nostalgia than, whilst doing so, basking in that nostalgia for yourself, remembering your first experiences with the game at a different, now lost part of your life. Yakuza 0 is, for all intents and purposes, the ultimate video game. A celebration of itself, chock full of gripping, gritty storytelling, outlandish combat, and a plethora of weird, wacky, and zany things to do. It's easily one of the best games in the whole series, and most assuredly one of the best video games I've ever played. As promised, I will be covering pretty much every Yakuza / Like a Dragon game that I can get my hands on, hopefully this side of 2030. Speaking of the future of this show, thank you to everyone who's joined me on this YouTube channel so far, whether you've been around since the beginning or just jumping in now. Your presence is very much appreciated. I've started to notice a few familiar faces pop up now and again in my comment sections, and that always makes my day. I hope you guys here and everyone else enjoy what this channel has in store for the future. Whilst I'm still also here giving out thanks, I also want to shout out the Dragon of Game FAQs, Cyric Z, for their incredibly robust, thorough and helpful Yakuza 0 guides. Being able to streamline some of the busy work guaranteed I'll be able to finish my playthrough this side of 2025. Anyway, going into Season 3 of Having a Mosey, I'm going to be focusing at least as much on video game series I've already started on this show, as well as new ones. So any fans, for example, of Gotoku, Dragon Quest and Fable amongst you certainly have something to look forward to. I want to thank everyone for their patience in terms of how long it took this particular video to come out. I had always intended for it to be a bit of a big lad, but as I kept playing, writing and editing it, it just became broader and broader in scope. Good job I definitely don't intend to be foolish enough to tackle any more large games in the near future, right? With all that said, please do consider joining me next time when I'll be talking about a different game. Starting Season 3 on familiar ground once more, we'll be returning to...
Objection!